On September 1st, Michelle Obansawin was sworn in as Canada's newest Supreme Court Justice. She's the first Indigenous person to serve on the top court, and in her application questionnaire, she said her experience as a parent, scholar, Francophone, and First Nations woman has given her lived insight into Canada's diversity. I spoke with Justice Obansawin this week about her new role inside the chamber of the Supreme Court. Madam Justice, nice of you to make the time.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate you being here. I'd be curious to know what you think from your past experience makes you a good Supreme Court Justice.
Well, I grew up in a little town with a big family, so you get to be quite vocal when you're in a big family. Not my immediate family, but my father, they were 8 kids, so you learn to be vocal, you learn to listen well, because you have to listen to everyone else to be able to speak. And especially my work in mental health, because when I was at the Royal, I worked with a lot of self-represented litigants, a lot of people who suffered from issues of mental illness, and that brings a whole new light. You see things differently after that.
In what way do you think?
I think you're more compassionate. You think more of how people, about their well-being. So I think it's really different that way.
Yeah. You're quite young. I think you're probably okay with me saying that.
Yes.
We're around the same age, that's why I say you're quite young. And so your experience is different than people who have been previously appointed to the court. There was some criticism maybe of that as you were appointed, that maybe you didn't have enough experience or enough publications. What did you make of that? Did you think that that was fair, or where did you think that was coming from?
Well, I think at the end of the day, no matter what, people are always going to complain. There are complainers out there no matter what. And I could have been perfect, and there would still have been complaints. So I think it's a fact of life. With any position you get named to, you're in the public eye, and you're always going to have those that are the naysayers, and so be it.
How does your lived experience, your background, do you think, how will that shape what you're doing here in this courtroom?
I think it gives me a unique perspective. I grew up in a very small French town in Northern Ontario, so that is unique into itself. Sure. As you work into a bigger city, as in Ottawa. And also, I'm an Indigenous woman, so I have that cultural background that's unique to me, and I think that gives me a different perspective.
How has it helped you so far in your career, do you think? Being bilingual, which I'll get to, because obviously that's an issue too, but also being Indigenous.
Well, I think it's been really important, especially to the research that I've done throughout my career. I did a lot of research in mental health, but now more recently with my PhD, I did a lot of research with regard to Gladue principles, and I've been a strong advocate about the significant issue related to the high incarceration rates of Indigenous people. We're less than 5% of the society, but we're close to 50% in women and over 30% of men. So I think that has really brought a lot of insight into working in that. And I've been really involved in my community and Abenaki also with community work that I've done there. So
I don't know how far you'll go in terms of talking about the Gladue principles, but for people that don't know, that is something that allows judges to consider what an Indigenous person has been through, past trauma, colonization. Exactly. I wonder how necessary you think the Gladue principles are to the justice system right now.
I think it's mandatory. I think it's something that's mandatory under the criminal code. I think that, of course, it has to be done in sentencing, in bail reviews, and we have to be cognizant about the lived experience of Indigenous people, how we got to where we are as a society within that society, and I think it's instrumental, especially when we're looking at sentencing and the high incarceration rates. You have to look and take everything into context.
Yeah, you wrote your thesis, your PhD thesis about it, but you have not allowed it to be made public, not even the abstract. Is that because there's something that would be questioned in there, or because you believe that you're going to have to use and talk about the Gladue principles so often? What's the reasoning there?
I don't even think it's one of those two. Okay. When it was time to consider if there would be an embargo or not, I met with my supervising team. And the discussion was had that as a sitting judge, was it an appropriate time to release this into the public domain? Because we do these in cycles of 5 years. So because it was something new. I don't think there are many judges who are sitting who are actually doing their PhDs crazy enough to do that at the same time. It was an unknown, so they recommended, and I followed the recommendation, that we put it under embargo for a period of 5 years, which they're in 5-year cycles. and we would revisit after the 4th year and see if we would maintain it or not.
I want to talk a little about what you've said about the Constitution. You said you believe it's a living document, that it has to evolve and change with us and with the country. And I wonder, to that end, do you believe that there is a ceiling for Indigenous rights, or is it a completely open-ended conversation in the Constitution?
I can't get into too much details of that, because these are clearly issues that will come before our court. But at the end of the day, the Constitution's there. There's protections under Section 35. Those are going to have to be evaluated, and whether there's a ceiling or not, I think it'll depend on what courts throughout Canada, including this one, will say about that.
How important is it for the Constitution to evolve, to reflect where we are as a society, to not remain stagnant?
I think it's really important, because where we were at back then when it was signed and where we are now has really evolved. We had main things like same-sex marriages, and if everything remained static, then we wouldn't have these great advancements. And I think these are things that evolve with time as society and what our needs are and our beliefs. So I think that it's important for it to be a living tree.
As an Indigenous person, do you think that it is, and again, I don't know how far you're going to go, we'll see, because I know what you have in front of the court, but how important is it to get some of that stuff made clear for Indigenous communities moving forward?
I think that everything is important to be clear, not just for Indigenous communities. So I think the goal of the Supreme Court, if I listen to our chief, is really to be as clear as possible when we're rendering decisions, for them to be understandable by the public at large. So I think clarity is always the key to anything that we're doing.
You're Franco-Ontarian, you're obviously fluently bilingual. There has been criticism of the requirement that justices now be bilingual, and actually particularly from some Indigenous justices and lawyers who believe that that sort of excludes some people who would be qualified. What do you think of that? Because you obviously are you embody all of these things. So how important do you think it is for a justice to be able to understand and communicate in French? Should that be a requirement?
I can't comment on whether or not it should be a requirement. That's a public political decision. At the end of the day, what I could tell you, though, is I've always been a staunch advocate for bilingualism. I think it's really important. I want my kids to be bilingual. For myself, it's really helped, I would say, with my success throughout my career. It's an added value to be bilingual as a lawyer and as a judge. So for me, myself, it's important to me. Yeah.
Mental health, you've mentioned it a couple of times. It was a big focus of your career as well, trying to find ways to better advocate for people with mental health problems. What are the big barriers you think that people are facing in the justice system? How are they being potentially sometimes forgotten?
Well, I think there's a stigma surrounding mental health. So what happens, I think, a lot of the times is people don't talk about it. They're afraid if they talk about the fact, well, I have depression, I'm on medication, there's an impact on my work. These are things, or even on your life. We'll see this in family law cases that we have in front of us. Will it impact how my children are taken care of? How is that going to be viewed by a third party? I think these are all things that are out there. I joined the Royal in 2009, and I have to say I've really seen an evolution about how people see mental health. Just in the general public, in the workplace, I've seen great improvements also. So I think that there is a barrier, because I think that some are still fearful of talking about it publicly, but the stigma has been lessened. So it's something that we have to keep talking about to remove those barriers.
What do you think is going to be your biggest challenge here?
My biggest challenge, I think, is just going to be the day of day, because at the end of the day, I'm working with 8 people. It's an arranged marriage. I don't think that's a challenge, but it's different, right? Because in the past, when I was in the court, I did sit on divisional court where we were panels of 3, but those always change. So now you're working with the same 8 people day in, day out for years to come. And it's not a challenge, but it's something different, because you're working with a large group of people. And one of the things, I guess my own personal challenge is to be more patient, because I'm used to writing a decision quickly and for it to go out. And here, there's a much bigger wheel. So I think for myself, I'm going to have to learn to be more patient about how long it takes before my decisions
Yeah,
get
it
out.
sometimes takes a long time.
Yeah, so I think that's going to be my biggest feat.
Justice, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very
Thank
much. Thanks.